Alan Taylor is the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He is only one of 5 history writers who have won the Pulitzer Prize twice. His 11 books focus mostly on the early years of the creation of the United States. His latest book is titled American Civil Wars, A Continental History, 1850 to 1873. During these 23 years, North America's 3 largest countries, Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., all transformed themselves into nations. Professor Taylor includes stories of black soldiers fighting for the Union, Native Americans struggling to preserve their homelands in the United States and the West, women fortifying the homeland, and newly arrived immigrants thrust into the maelstrom of the Civil War.
Hi, it's Kayla from C-SPAN. Imagine 45 years ago when there was just a handful of television networks. C-SPAN first went on the air bringing an unfiltered view of government directly to America's living rooms. No spin, no commentary, just pure democracy in action.
And it's Greta from C-SPAN. It was a bold experiment. We finally had a front row seat to Congress, the White House, and the campaign trail, all without government funding.
As we celebrate 45 years and a legacy of unfiltered access, we ask for your support of a donation in honor of our 4 decades of service. Your gift, no matter how big or small, will help maintain this vital resource for access to the democratic process.
You can help ensure another 45 years of witnessing history unfold and empowering citizens to be informed and engaged in the political process. Visit cspan.org/donate today and join our 45th anniversary campaign.
Thank you for supporting C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government. Visit cspan.org/donate today to make your gift of support. Thank you.
Alan Taylor, professor at the University of Virginia in history. When did you first get interested in this subject?
In the subject of history? Well,
Yeah.
Since I was a very young child, I had the good fortune that my mother loved public libraries and would take me with her, and we'd go into the Portland, Maine Public Library. And she'd go and do her shopping and just leave me there for the whole afternoon. I was probably 6, 7, 8 years old. Probably something like that wouldn't be done today. But I just fell in love with reading history books.
When did you start focusing on the early years of the United States?
I've always been most interested in the 18th century and early 19th century, so before the creation of the United States, and then the early years of the United States. That's always been my prime fascination.
Can you remember where you went first to find out about it?
Well, I tell the story. It's like any story you tell. You have to pick where does it begin and where does it end. And so when I was in 2nd grade, I think, I was in a rural Maine school, public school, where there were 4 2nd grade classes, and we were all summoned in sequence to the school library. And unfortunately, my 2nd grade class was the last one to get there. And so all of the books on dinosaurs, which was my other great fascination, probably my primary fascination at that time, all the other boys were pawing through the dinosaur books, and I had no dinosaur book available. So I picked up a children's biography of Daniel Boone, so The Frontier, Early America. And so I'd like to say that's where it all began.
Your first book, where were you when you submitted the request or got an agent, or how did you do it? Where were you?
Well, I didn't have an agent for the first book. The first book was my dissertation, and I had a postdoctoral fellowship. And the terms of the postdoctoral fellowship were that they had the rights to publish it through the University of North Carolina Press. So there was nothing that I needed to do at that point except revise the manuscript. So that was pretty easy. And it was only later that I got an agent once I had done a couple of books.
As you know, you've gotten a lot of awards. And in my introduction, I say you're one of only 5 people that have won the Pulitzer Prize. History writers have won the Pulitzer Prize twice. Mm-hmm. Did you ever think that that was going to be one of the fortunes of writing books?
Absolutely no. I mean, it's It's utterly unpredictable. So, people who are very kind will say, well, do you think you'll win a third? That's the one thing I'm pretty sure won't happen. So it made a world of difference in my career to have won, especially the first one, at the point that I did win it, which was early in my career. And the way the Pulitzer Board handles it is they don't contact the winners directly. Instead, they just issue a press release. And so I found out about it because my phone was ringing off the hook from local radio stations and newspapers wanting to have a quick interview with me. And I had just come off playing tennis and playing very badly, and I was very frustrated with things. And I go in my office and I really need a shower. And instead, I'm deluged by these phone calls. And, initially I'm going, is this a joke or something? But then it piles up. And then the press office for the university that I was then at said, we have to have a press conference for you. I said, I've got to go take a shower first. So we postponed the press conference. It's the only time in my life that I've had a press conference.
So what direct impact did winning a Pulitzer have on you?
Well, it meant that there were several universities that were interested in employing me. It meant that there were more people who were interested in seeing if I would write a book and publish with their press. It meant there were more graduate students who wanted to come and work with me. It's just kind of across the board. So suddenly the challenge comes early in your career. You're trying to get these things, and you're working hard to do so. And then the challenge after the Pulitzer is, how do I winnow it down to what I can actually accomplish?
Where were you teaching when you won that first award?
I was at the University of California at Davis in Northern California.
How long did you stay there after that?
I stayed there another 10 years. Well, more than that. I think another 14 years.
And did you go anywhere between Davis and University of California, Davis and Virginia?
No.
When somebody comes to your class, say undergraduates, what's your philosophy of teaching them?
Well, it depends on the type of class. So generally there are two types of classes. One is a lecture class where I'll have 50 to 150 students in it. And the danger there is that the students sit there passively, and in this age, they've got access to cell phones. So you do have to try to be entertaining. You do have to actively discourage them from using their cell phones during class. A lot of them use their computers to take notes, but there's nothing that can prevent them from surfing the internet. So I try to make it interesting as I can, and I try to fill it in with lots of questions and even some role playing while I'm doing that. So to some degree to make it a performance, and in other degrees to make it something that's highly participatory for them. The other type of class is a seminar. So that's approximately 12, 15 students, and they will have done reading. And then we talk about the readings. We talk about some images that I put up, and historical images to interpret what's going on in them. And that's even more participatory. That's where I do less talking and they do more.
This book that we're talking about today is the fourth in a series, the Penguin History of the United States series, and I counted up.
Let me just correct that. The first in the series was published by Penguin.
Oh, it was, okay.
Okay, and the more recent 3 volumes, including the current ones, published by Norton. So it's my series primarily with Norton, but it started out being with Penguin. And Penguin has other authors that are doing in their History of the United States series.
What I was going to get to was that since you've published these 4 books, it's 2,526 pages of copy and sources and notes and all that. How do you do this? What's the setup? Where do you do it? And how long does it take you to research? And what's the best source of research?
Well, I do 2 types of books in the series we're talking about now, which is a continental history of the United States. So in the context of all of North America, including Mexico and Canada and the West Indies, and especially Native peoples in the West. There's no way that I could do primary research on that geographic scale for many, many years, which these books include. So these are overview books. They're meant to be introductions for readers who want to know more about the United States, but want to do so in this bigger context. So for that, I'm dependent on other historians and archaeologists who have written specialized articles and books. So my method is to try to figure out what will be the chapters. In each chapter, who are the leading scholars, and then go and get their books and their articles, and then sit down and write one chapter after another, where I'm trying to figure out how do I boil this down into something that makes sense to me and that I can try to make sense of to readers. The other type of book I do is more research oriented. It's specialized. It looks at particular families, particular places, in more limited periods of time, and that involves going and spending a lot of time in archives.
Publishers Weekly had a review of, I think it was your third book, American Republics. That doesn't matter because I get a sense in reading this latest one that you've done that there's a lot of some of the same characters in these books. But I do want to read this and get you to parse it for us. The reviewer said, the portrait of the U.S. that emerges is not flattering. Taylor foregrounds white supremacy, sexism, slavery, the miseries of industrial capitalization, the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans, and atrocities committed by U.S. soldiers in the Mexican War. What do you think of that summation of what you wrote?
Well, I would say that it's an accurate partial summation of what I do. So what I try to do in the books is to say, in particular the American republics, is that our republic is an experiment, and it's an experiment where it's a mistake for us to assume that the original creators got it all right. I think it's an experiment where they were very bold and daring about creating a republican format for the country, small r republic, on an enormous geographic scale, and to create a union of the states. And it would have been extraordinary if, given the values of the time and the limited technology of the time, if it worked perfectly from the start. And that it's very important, I think, for us as Americans to see, warts and all, how it went into operation. It's not to undervalue the importance of our Republican institutions, but it is to see that their potential is something that has to be worked for in every generation of Americans. So the other side of the coin that I would say to that particular review is, all the things you say are quite true, but there are also people who throughout that period of time who were working very hard to try to realize the immense potential of the American Republic and its union of the states.
Who, in your opinion, or maybe there's more than one, was the smartest of the founders?
Well, that's a hard one to say. There were a lot of smart people there. So you kind of have to pick bits and pieces from them. I would say George Washington's the most important of the founders because he's a figure of immense dignity who is committed to free government, and he's committed to the Union of the States. And he's the one figure that can be the transitional figure for Americans who are coming out of a political culture that featured monarchy into a republic where you have an elected president. So I would say, most people would not say, well, Washington's not all that smart. Well, he's plenty smart. And if you read his letters, he really gets right to the essence of issues. Now, on pure brilliance, you'd probably say Alexander Hamilton, but Hamilton was utterly lacking in political common sense frequently in his career. You could say in terms of philosophy, Thomas Jefferson's very impressive, but it's a philosophy that often doesn't hold up when applied to actually practical situations. So I would say you're hard pressed to say, well, this one is the really brilliant one, but collectively they were an extraordinary generation of leadership.
When over the years when you've written history, when have you said, I don't like this person?
Well, that will happen quite a bit, particularly when you write about slavery. So there's no shortage, or you write about the people who took a particularly genocidal approach toward dealing with native peoples. So to read what George Rogers Clark has to say about conquering native peoples west of the Appalachians makes it pretty hard to like him.
As you know, one way to get people riled up is to accuse, and on both sides, on all sides, accuse this of being a white supremacist nation. Mm-hmm. Describe what you're saying when you talk about white supremacy.
Well, it's impossible to read the political discourse of American leaders in the period before the Civil War without being astonished by, to be blunt, the casual racism. The assumption that white people are the superior race. Racialized thinking was prevalent. Now, that's not to say it's universal. There were people, abolitionists, who were working very hard to say, what's going on here? Let's live up to the real credo of all men are created equal. But they were a minority among Americans of the first half of the 19th century. So I don't think you can tell the story of a country which was committed to expansion westward and committed to a union of the states that would protect slavery without understanding how did they justify this to themselves. And the primary way they did it was by saying white people are superior to every other race. And that's just the way they expressed themselves.
What's the history of sexism in the United States?
Well, I don't ever use the term sexism in the book, or the books, but I do talk about how there is an understanding of gender, which for almost all Americans accepted the premise that men and women are radically different beings and that they have different qualities. And so the male qualities are those of being resourceful and forceful and aggressive. And so they have the public role. And that women are the nurturers, and they're more religious, and they should be in a more domestic sphere. So certainly there are people who fulfill both of those descriptions, but they can be found on both sides of the gender line. And but there was an insistence that this gender line was entirely sharp, and so that everybody should be married because men and women were so perfectly different and perfectly complementary.
There's a person in your book, I'm kind of jumping into the middle, by the name of William Brownlaw. Mm-hmm. And I bring him up, and I'm going to read what you quoted in there just to put it in context, because it seems to be an important part of the book. Outraged by Uncle Tom's Cabin, Brownlaw blasted Harriet Beecher Stowe as, quote, ugly as original sin, an abomination in the eyes of civilized people, a tall, coarse, vulgar-looking woman, stoop-shouldered with a long yellow neck and a long beaked nose, through which she speaks. Mm-hmm. What's the story behind that?
Okay, so I think most of your listeners would know Harriet Beecher Stowe was a leading novelist in the United States in the 1850s, and she had published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a melodramatic novel that was extraordinarily popular. So it's the biggest selling American book of the time. And it outrages a lot of Southerners because it's a stark portrayal of the abuse of enslaved people. And so somebody like Parson Brownlaw, he was a Methodist minister and an editor of a newspaper. He's very eloquent in denunciation of the broad array of people that he disliked. And they happened to include Harriet Beecher Stowe, even though he had never met her. So what he's having to say about her to dismiss her physical appearance in order to justify denigrating her words in print, it was a pretty common practice in that culture for men to do. So, but what's interesting about Brownlaw is that he was committed to the Union. And so when the South secedes, he's in East Tennessee, he's among the leaders of Eastern Tennessee to fight against the Confederacy. And in the course of doing so, he would become radicalized and he would support the abolition of slavery. And he would become a radical Republican governor of Tennessee for a while. So what I find interesting about Brownlaw and many of these people of that generation, including Lincoln, is their capacity for growth as they are under the duress of the crisis of the Civil War to think new thoughts.
How widely read was Uncle Tom's Cabin back in those days?
It was very widely read. I would say probably, most Americans were familiar with it either from reading the novel, and it was published in installments originally, or plays. There were many plays that were based on Uncle Tom's Cabin, and probably more people saw plays that were based on Uncle Tom's Cabin than read the original novel.
Would you assign that for reading today?
I wouldn't assign it if your goal was to read a really effective, sophisticated novel. It's very melodramatic. It doesn't really play well to what we look for in a good novel today. But if I wanted somebody to understand the sentimentalism of 19th century American culture, I certainly would assign it.
Here's another paragraph, a couple pages later. The chair of the committee, Benjamin F. Wade of Ohio, privately accused Lincoln of murdering, this is in quotes, murdering your country by inches, unquote, with, quote, a blundering, cowardly, inefficient prosecution of the war. Seeking better relations, Lincoln invited Wade and his wife to a dinner and a ball at the White House. Wade replied, quote, are the President and Mrs. Lincoln aware that there is a civil war? If they are not, Mr. and Mrs. Wade are, and for that reason declined to participate in feasting and dancing. Again, what were you getting at there?
Well, what I'm getting at is that Lincoln had probably the most difficult political situation that any American president has faced. And that included the people who were his political allies. Wade's his political ally. He's a fellow Republican. Lincoln is trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and the Union has shattered. And he's trying to keep more conservative Americans on board with this war against the Confederacy to reunite the Union. And that's not to the satisfaction of Benjamin Wade and other radical Republicans who believe that if you aggressively move against slavery, and Lincoln was slow initially in the war to make it a crusade against slavery. And Wade thinks that if you also only have radical Republicans as your generals and are willing to burn a lot more Southern towns and farms, that you will win this war more quickly. And Lincoln, who is a great coalition builder and much savvier politician than Benjamin Wade or any of the other radical Republicans, understands that he's got to bring public opinion along with him. And he's got to hold together a country in which these border states like Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland are essential if there's to be a military victory over the Confederacy. So what I'm getting at in that thing is to just show the difficulties that Lincoln is facing within his own party, and also the psychological stress that the war takes on him. And that to say that Lincoln is responsible for all the deaths is an awfully cruel thing to say to somebody who felt sorely the death of any person. Lincoln was an extraordinarily sensitive person, and he hated all of the bloodshed and slaughter and maiming that was going on in this war. And he's only willing to support it in the hopes that he can bring it to an end sooner and reunite the Union, which he saw as the essential framework for free government, not just in the United States, but anywhere in the world.
When you're talking about Abraham Lincoln early in your book, there's a sentence that kind of jumped out at me, and I wanted to ask you about it. These are your words. Nor did he have a God to console him, for Lincoln could not believe in one or an afterlife. How do you know that?
Well, I know this because other historians who've read his writings very closely, that's what they have concluded. So in that particular passage, I think I'm drawing very closely on David Donald, who was one of the great biographers of Abraham Lincoln.
What impact did that have on Lincoln in his presidency?
Well, I think that, I'm describing Lincoln in his early life. And I think once he gets in the midst of the slaughter of the war, I do think he became a great believer in a kind of vague concept of the divine that we would call providence. That there ultimately should be some larger divine power, that if the United States does the right things, that divine power will reward the United States. So he's a highly moral man. He lives by a very strict moral code. But it's one that has so much compassion in it, including for those people like Benjamin Wade, who spend a lot of time saying very hateful things about him. So it's understandable that when Lincoln was assassinated on Good Friday in 1865, that there's suddenly this reverence for him that hadn't at all been in evidence while he was alive. And people weren't bashful about saying there's something very Christ-like about Lincoln. And you can find, and I want to be careful here, I'm not saying that he was Christ-like, it's just that people could see that aspect of his compassion for people suddenly with a clarity that they did not see before he was dead.
Your take on Andrew Johnson, who assumed the presidency after he was assassinated?
Well, I would say one of the greatest tragedies of American political life is Lincoln's assassination, and for many reasons. He was a politician that he'd weathered the Civil War, and he could have, I think, done a good job of getting the country off to a better start in the Reconstruction of the Union that followed. And it's hard to imagine somebody who would do a worse job than Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a petty man in many, many ways. He's incapable of working with people who disagree with him. And he is at odds with almost all the Republican leaders. So where Lincoln would work with people who disagreed with him, Johnson just treated them as enemies. And so he really did. And also, Andrew Johnson never lets go of his concepts of white supremacy. He's very open about it. So he's one of the worst figures to try to entrust to putting the country back together again, while making sure that the end of slavery does not lead to some form of serfdom for African Americans. And on that score, Johnson was an abject failure.
Why do you say he pardoned, or better put, why did he pardon 13,500 of the 15,000 who applied? And you say that in your book.
Well, a couple of reasons. One is Andrew Johnson was a man of very limited education. He came from a humble class, and he had felt that the planter elite, with their genteel manners, who had been running states like Tennessee before the Civil War, he's very angry toward them. But it turns out if they will come hat in hand and beg him for a pardon, that's just too thrilling for Andrew Johnson to resist. So that's one part of it. I wouldn't say it's the biggest part. The biggest part is he's trying to build his own party of political support. And he's hoping that the southern states will all support him so he can be elected as the president in 1868. And he knows that he can't really count on the Republicans with whom he's feuding. So he has to rebuild the Democratic Party, of which he had been a member before the Civil War. He has to rebuild it. He wants to rebuild it largely on the old lines, which was that it was based in the South. And that's why he's pardoning all of these people. That's the primary reason.
You write that Southerners insisted that any elevation of the blacks will be the degradation of the whites.
That's what they believed. They thought it was a zero-sum game. And it's not just in the South that they believe this. You would find politicians in the North appealing to immigrant voters, say in New York, saying, and any time that a black person gets a job or they get some new rights, that's at your expense. That was a winning formula for American elections until we get to the Civil War and in many places after the Civil War.
What's your take on what the Civil War was fought for? What was it about?
It was about restoring the union of the states, because the understanding was that if you don't have a union of the states, if one part breaks apart, where does it stop? The other parts will break apart. And then you will have endless wars within North America between the former states of the United States, and you'll end up replicating the bloody, tragic history of Europe. That's what it was fought to restore the Union. But along the way, Lincoln and the Republicans realized we can't restore the Union unless we smash slavery. Because what good would it be if we, at gunpoint, we forced Southern states back into the Union and they still have slavery? We're just going to repeat this whole tragedy again and again and again. So they come to the conclusion in the middle of the war that a restoration of the Union will not happen, will not endure in any case, unless slavery is destroyed.
What were they thinking when they wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution about all men are created equal?
Well, that statement's only in the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the Constitution. It's in the preamble to the Declaration. So it's a philosophical statement. It's a philosophical universal statement, which is very hard to realize in the practicalities of life in a country where a fifth of the people were held in slavery, which is the United States of 1776. So it lays down a marker of saying this is our ideal. And we're operating out of this ideal in declaring our independence from the British Empire. Okay, so that's an important thing to do. But then what do you do once you've achieved your independence? Are you going to try to fulfill that ideal, which will dispossess thousands of white families of the largest part of their capital investment? Because enslaved people were a form of property, and they added up in value to more than the value of the land that they were working in the South. So once you create or once you live within a system, because Americans didn't create slavery, but once you live within that system of property in which inheritance and debt are all hinged upon these human beings being treated as assets rather than as human beings, then it's almost impossible to get out of it without widespread violence, which is what the Civil War ended up being.
What's your reaction when you hear people, I'm sure at the University of Virginia, among your friends, saying this is the worst time in history?
Well, I would say that's not true. I would say that the crisis that leads to the dissolution of the Union is an even worse time than we live in. I'm not trivializing the problems of political polarization in our country today. But we're not close to the existential crisis that the United States faced at the end of the 1850s and start of the 1860s. But it's very important for us to understand that existential crisis that the nation narrowly survived, and to be very careful in our rhetoric about our political opponents so that we don't ever get anywhere close to that brink again.
So when I read the following quote, it did come to mind all of the rhetoric we're hearing today. And this was a quote from a former Confederate in your book.
Mm-hmm.
I get up at 4:30 in the morning and sit up till 12 at night to hate them. A woman, as you say, quote, added, "Oh, how I hate the Yankees. I could trample on their dead bodies and spit on them."
Mm-hmm.
What's that representing in your book? What's the point?
Well, I think that we have for a very long time tended to partially sanitize the Civil War as being a relatively polite war fought only on battlefields. Now, I want to be clear, those battlefields are enormously important and involve masses of men. So absolutely important to the war. But the war is a pervasive war that is fought in the hearts and minds and households throughout the South, and indeed also throughout the North. And when you have, we now think there were probably about 800,000 people, soldiers, who were killed in this war, and we're not entirely clear on how many civilians were killed. But when you have that many Americans who are killed, and even more who are severely wounded and will bear the scars of this for the rest of their lives, it affects every family in America. It's really hard not to hate the people who you blame for this. So there were, and especially in the South, because we focus on Sherman's march and how destructive it was, but Sherman's march is just part of a bigger story of Union troops burning and pillaging. And so this leaves a residue in the South among the white Southerners of intense hatred.
What's your opinion of William T. Sherman's march?
Sherman is one of the most fascinating people in 19th century history. He's a man who actually had lived in the South for a long period of time. He actually liked the Southern way of life. He himself had racial views that were compatible with Southerners. He wasn't a big fan of slavery, but he also did not believe that blacks were equal. So, but Sherman is a guy who comes to understand, and initially, like a lot of Union officers, they thought if we just kind of play nice and preserve civilian property and civilian lives, that Southerners will come to their senses quickly. And Sherman then comes to understand, as most Union generals did come to understand by the end of 1862, that there was no kind of charm offensive that you could use to draw Southern Confederates back into the Union, that you would have to make war as painful as you could in the destruction of property. Now, it's very important to bear in mind, it's a mistake to call what Sherman does total war, because he's not massacring people. Except on the battlefield, where both sides are trying to massacre each other. But he's not massacring civilians. He's not massacring prisoners. He's trying to protect lives. He's trying to prevent rapes. But he's not trying to prevent people from burning farms and looting them and burning barns, or from liberating enslaved people or appropriating their livestock. So it's a highly, highly destructive operation. But he would do even worse when he got into South Carolina. And other Union generals are doing stuff in the Shenandoah Valley in northern Virginia and in eastern Mississippi. It's a very destructive war.
George McClellan ran against Abraham Lincoln in 1864. What do you think of him?
McClellan is a guy who looks like he should be a great general. He looks great in a uniform. He rides a horse nicely. He's a handsome man. His soldiers loved him. But he's about the last person you'd want to put in command of an army, because he never feels like he's army is prepared enough. He never feels like he's got an edge over his adversary. He never really understands his adversary, who was Robert E. Lee in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. And Lee is a far, far better general than McClellan was. And this was a problem because McClellan had come to seem to Lincoln and other top Republican leaders as the general who could organize an army, true, and then lead it into combat successfully against Lee, not true, as McClellan proved early and often, until he got fired.
How big did he lose?
Well, he always had the larger army, even though he always believed he had the smaller army. And so he doesn't lose catastrophically the way some of the other Union generals did, in which their armies were routed and sent into flight. But it's more that he's actually looks like he's winning on the battlefield, and then he gets spooked and he pulls his troops back, and then he starts retreating and retreating. So he turns what should have been victories into strategic defeats.
In your 4-part book series on the subject of American colonies and revolutions and republics, these 4 different books, did I read it right that Eric Foner edited your first?
He was the general editor of the first book, yes.
The reason I bring it up, of course, he's well known for his book on Reconstruction. Mm-hmm. How difficult is it when you are a writer and you have somebody that has the expertise editing your book? How does that fit together when you say, no, I don't agree with that?
Well, I wouldn't say it's difficult. I have great respect for Eric. He's one of the greatest historians that we have. And I actually, his father was one of my undergraduate professors at Colby College. So Eric and I did have one disagreement in the process. And as an editor, Eric wasn't somebody who was line editing things, but he's reading the whole thing and thinking about, okay, are there places we should condense or places we should expand or rearrange in some way? So it's bigger picture stuff. And on virtually all issues, we agreed except one. The book was too long, the book manuscript. And he said, well, there's kind of an easy solution. This is a book about colonial America, and you've got all these chapters about the Great Plains and the Pacific. Why don't we just eliminate those? And I said, no, those will be the most important chapters in the book. They will make this book different than your typical book about colonial America. So they have to stay in, but I understand your point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through every chapter, and I'm going to tighten every single one to meet the quota, but we're going to keep the Pacific and the Great Plains. And he was fine with that in the end. And I think he would agree now that that we worked out a compromise that made the book better.
When you wrote that first book, did you know you were going to have at least 3 others after the first one?
No.
How did that happen?
Well, I didn't even know that I'd write this first one. It's not something that I had the idea and I went to Eric Foner with. It's Eric Foner called me up and because he'd liked the preceding book I'd done, William Cooperstown, and said, I'd like you to, we got this Penguin series, and I'd like you to do the volume on colonial America. I was a little surprised because I'd been writing books about the early Republic, about the early United States, not about the colonial period. But I've been teaching the colonial period. I was really excited by the new scholarship that was emerging, particularly about the role of Native peoples. And so I said initially to Eric, well, I'm really more comfortable with the Revolution and Early Republic. And he said, well, you can do that volume instead if you like. And I said, well, let me think about it. And the next day I called him back and I said, I'd like to do the colonial volume because I had come to see that that would be the more interesting challenge. And I'm glad I did it. I had no idea how I was going to write a book on this geographic scale of an entire continent over hundreds of years, and because it deals in part with Native peoples long before 1492. But it was fun to try to figure it out. And after that, I sort of thought, well, that's the one book I'll do of this type. And I went back to doing close research books. But then I was doing a lot of programs with K-12 teachers in history. And I would have a lot of these teachers say, well, we teach American colonies and we find it helpful. Are you going to do a sequel on the Revolution? And that planted the seed. And I eventually decided, yeah, I would continue telling the story with the Revolution book. And then I thought, well, I really want to carry it into the early Republic. And that was the third one. Probably the bigger stretch is to do the Civil War era, because usually early American historians, which is the category I belong to, kind of stop looking at things after the 1830s. But I've long been interested in the Civil War era, and I have in part taught courses that touch upon it. So that's why I decided I would stretch this series into a fourth book.
What do you think of the knowledge level of an undergraduate student that comes into your class?
I would say the knowledge level is not all that different from what it was 20, 30 years ago. What I think is different is that they don't write at the same level that students used to do. There are a whole variety of reasons why this may be the case. But we'll just say, we live in a world where people read a lot more on their computer screen or their phones than will read in books. And therefore, the habits of mind that are necessary to kind of sit down with some patience and write something and then edit it, that's really not as present as it used to be.
I talk to a lot of authors that still write in longhand. What do you do?
I did that for a very long time, but I've now gotten so I can compose on the computer. I used to be terrified by that cursor just flashing away at me. So I would write out longhand and then enter it into the computer, because it's easier, of course, to edit on the computer.
Years ago, David Halberstam told me in an interview that because of the computer, he wrote longer.
There can be that risk. And my books, I think, are probably plenty long. But, they're not at Halberstam's level. I think David Halberstam had great difficulty leaving out any of his notes. And if you want a really tight book, you've got to you've got to go through the painful process of leaving a lot of good stuff out, so that the truly exceptional material just stands out. And that's what I work toward. I can't say I've fully achieved it, but that's what I work toward.
I saw you give a presentation, I think it was actually at the University of Virginia, on video, where you focused on a letter from a slave to his master after the war.
Former slave.
Former slave, yeah, very important.
Yeah, that's very important.
Do you have that letter with you?
I don't have it with me, but I know it quite well because I've spoken about it many times and I've read it over many times.
Why don't you try to do that? I have a copy of part of it here, but go ahead and explain what that letter was about and why it struck you as being so important.
Well, I found this letter in the National Archives, and it was in a collection of documents filed by slave owners after the War of 1812 to seek compensation for slaves who had escaped and gone off with the British, of which there were several thousand. And in this file was this letter written by a man named Bartlett Shanklin. Now, these files are voluminous. And when I went through them, my assumption was that the letters would be entirely by these white masters and their neighbors, because literacy, while not unknown among enslaved peoples, was rare. And ordinarily, the people of that time who kept archives at that time were not that interested in preserving the words of enslaved people or former enslaved people. So when I came across this letter, I'm going, what's going on here? Because this guy, who's Bartlett Shanklin? And he's writing this letter, which is a very pointed one toward his master, Abraham Huey, I didn't know it was his master initially, but then I went through my notes on computer and I found out that Bartlett Shanklin was an enslaved person, that I had found him in another document elsewhere. And then suddenly it made sense to me. This is a letter written by a former slave from Virginia, from the northern neck of Virginia, not too far from Washington, D.C. He's writing it from Preston in Nova Scotia, which was the primary community that former slaves who had gone to the British were resettled at after the War of 1812. And in this letter, he is emphasizing that he had succeeded, that he was making money, and he wants Huey to know it. And he wants to say, in effect, I'm a better man. Why is he a better man? Because he's done this without exploiting the labor of other people held in servitude. So it's a phenomenal letter. It also refers in some ways to the escape that Shanklin had evidently led, because he refers to having led others out. It involves stealing a ferry boat in the middle of the night, rallying men, women, and children to get on this ferry boat, go down the Potomac River, and find a British warship. And Shanklin was the mastermind behind this very difficult operation. And he doesn't go into the details of it, though we know some of the details from other documents submitted by Huey. But he makes it clear that he has done this, and he wants Huey to know. So it speaks to the pride that Bartlett Shanklin has in his accomplishments and his sense of injustice, that his merits as a person, as a hardworking blacksmith, had been exploited rather than rewarded by his master. But it also indicates that he wanted the respect of his master, and he hadn't got it as a slave, and he wants it by sending him this letter.
Where did he, I don't know if it's obvious, but I saw the letter and the script, and it was, as you said, it was an elegant signature that he had. Where did he learn to write? Because weren't a lot of slaves prevented from doing that?
Well, it's not exactly encouraged, I would say, in this period of time. Now, in 1832, Virginia will outlaw, make it very clear that you are not to teach an enslaved person to read and write. Before then, the government has not outlawed it, but most white people don't encourage it. The great fear is that enslaved people will be able to write letters to coordinate resistance over long stretches of territory, or probably more pressing danger is they'll write passes for themselves so that they can use this to escape. Or they can read things like the Declaration of Independence saying all men are created equal. So that they want to keep enslaved people ignorant. But let me put an asterisk on this. In this earlier period, before 1832, there are a lot of Methodists and Baptists who actually want enslaved people to embrace their church and want them to be able to read the Bible. Another asterisk, which is there are masters like Huey who have a highly skilled enslaved person like Shanklin, who is a blacksmith. He's not just working for Huey, he's also working for the other white people in the neighborhood who are bringing work, and he has to keep accounts of what blacksmith work he's done so that Huey can collect money from these other neighbors who've come in to have a plow straightened out, for example, or a horse shoed. So these enslaved people have many roles, and the majority of them are farm hands working in the fields. They don't need literacy for their jobs. But there's a significant number, let's just say about 25% of enslaved people in Virginia, who have more skilled jobs as coopers and tailors and shoemakers and blacksmiths and carpenters, and they often have to keep accounts, and their masters actually encourage them to have some basic literacy and numeracy. So it's not surprising, it's not It's not unknown that somebody like Shanklin would have some literacy, but who exactly was his teacher? There's no way of recovering that right now.
When you talked about the Shanklin letter, I got online trying to find some others. And here's one. You probably know this letter. This is from August the 7th, 1865, right after the war was over. And it's to my old master, Colonel P.H. Anderson. Mm-hmm. He starts off by saying, "Sir, I got your letter and was glad to find that you have not forgotten Jordan," that's the name of the enslaved person, and that he's out now, and that you wanted me to come back and live with you again, promising to do better for me than anybody else. I have often felt uneasy about you. And then I'll jump to the second page. It's a fairly long letter. And Jordan says, "I served you faithfully for 32 years, and Mandy, 20 years, his wife, at $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy. Our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add this interest to this for the time, and our wages would have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor's visits to me and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to." And it amounts to, as I said earlier, $11,680. How often did you find that kind of thing in a letter where the master wanted a former slave to come back?
Well, you find a lot of evidence that masters suffer from the delusion that they are good masters, and therefore their enslaved people should come back to them. But, another quote which I have in the book is a traveler says to an enslaved woman, don't you have a master, a good master who takes good care of you? And the response by the enslaved person was, "I could take better care of myself." So these letters are very interesting. We only have them for a relatively small number of former enslaved people writing to their masters, expressing themselves, but they're very revealing, those that we do have, of their sense of pride, of wounded pride. And the letter that you just quoted is particularly effective because it reminds us of just how much was taken from enslaved people if you deny them the fruits of their labor for 30, 40, 50 years of their lives.
Couple of minutes left, and we have not talked about a significant part of your book, and that is the Canadian story and the Mexican story. Mm-hmm. Kind of give us a little bit from both of those, and why did you decide to include that in the book?
Well, I decided to include it because I don't think we can really fully understand the American Civil War if we think its effects were just confined within the boundaries of the United States. The Civil War has a powerful effect on Canada. There is a great fear in Canada that the American Civil War is going to spill over the northern border and lead to the annexation of Canada to join the Union as additional states in a coerced process. At that time, Canada was part of the British Empire, but it was a part of the British Empire that had been granted considerable autonomy for its legislatures. And there was a union between 2 of the Canadian provinces, the provinces we now call Ontario and Quebec. The other Canadian provinces were primarily the maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland. They were separate British colonies. They were not at that time united as part of Canada. And but fear of the United States, aggression, is what helped to contribute to the British pressure on the Canadians, including the maritime people, that they needed to pull together so that they could offer a more effective defense of all of these provinces against the potential of an American invasion, which seemed as great in 1865 as it had ever been since the end of the War of 1812.
Who is
Go ahead.
Who was John Macdonald?
John A. Macdonald was the premier Canadian politician of the 19th century, and he is probably the most essential man at pulling together a Canadian Confederation. Not the only man. He couldn't have done this on his own. There were other key leaders that helped him. But MacDonald was a political genius. And so he's the essential man at the center of the formation of the Canadian Confederation.
Who was Benito Juarez?
Well, Benito Juarez has to be on your short list of the most impressive political leaders of the 19th century in North America. Mexico was bitterly divided between two political parties, the liberals, they were called, and the conservatives. The conservatives were traditionalists who favored the Catholic Church and its authority over the entire society, favored landlords, favored the military that was quite parasitical over the people. And the liberals were the believers in individualism and individual rights. They were people who loved the American Declaration of Independence and its philosophy. And they loved the U.S. Constitution. And they wanted to make Mexico more like the United States, to make it more truly a republic. And Benito Juarez is the most important of the liberal leaders. And he has on his hands a civil war within Mexico that is even more brutal and destructive than what happens in the United States with its civil war, in that the conservatives bring in the assistance of France. So France sends over 20,000 troops, and they are busily trying to suppress liberalism throughout the country with lots of atrocities on both sides. But the conservatives and the French are particularly brutal. And Juarez comes within a few inches of losing it all. And he's reduced at one point in 1865 to being just south of El Paso, Texas. That's his one last foothold in Mexico. But from that, he's such a figure of dignity and consistency and resolve and a commitment to Republican government and to individual rights that he gradually rebuilds the liberal movement with the help of a lot of guerrilla chieftains, and will, once the French withdraw their troops in 1867, he will sweep back into Mexico City, and it will be the triumph of the liberal movement in Mexico.
This book is called American Civil Wars. Will there be a fifth book in the series?
Maybe someday. There'll be a little bit of a hiatus, but I think I would like to tell the story of the next generation at some point. I'm particularly interested in how Mexico plays out in the later 19th century and the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And then American expansion westward and the consolidation of American control over the West at the same time.
Last quick business question. Of the 4 books in this series, which one sold the most?
American Colonies is probably the one that has sold the most.
Alan Taylor, University of Virginia history professor and winner of all kinds of awards, written a whole bunch of books. And we thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Brian. This has been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.